Welcome to Green and Red, scrappy politics for scrappy people. A regular podcast on radical, environmental and anti-capitalist politics. Brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
It's been a while, but we're back, and we haven't done the weekend review for a couple of weeks. So we thought we'd come on today and do a Halloween show because it's a scary place in the world. And as you can see, my co-host today, Scott's away, so I was able to get Donald Trump on. No other media will take him, but Green and Red is open-minded. So welcome to the Green and Red podcast, ex-President Trump. So it's good to have you here.
It's the best podcast ever. Most amazing podcast ever.
It's beautiful. We have the most beautiful words of any podcast too. We obviously want to thank
the video is the most amazing video I've ever seen.
We obviously want to thank all of you for watching and ex-President Trump for coming in. And don't forget, we have postcards, Green and Red, and we have some great shows. Scott, who's not here right now, and I both got this book this week. It's a new book about Johnny Cash by Michael Stewart Foley, who's a friend of ours, and we're going to have him on before too long. And dropping soon is an interview with Sarah Gubadara, who is the head of a group called Legacies of War, which talks about trying to find undetonated bombs in Laos, which the U.S. war ended like almost 50 years ago, and there are still 80 million undetonated bomblets in Laos. So we got a lot going on. But today we're going to scare you with tales from campus. As a professor, this is something that's been important to me, and it's something that's in the news quite a bit. So we're going to talk a little bit about what life is like on campus. And I know, President Trump, I know that you're a big advocate of shutting down free speech on campus and getting rid of radical Marxist professors, right?
Yeah, unless it's on at Trump University, and if when it's at Trump University, then free speech reigns supreme.
Is it possible for me to get an honorary degree from Trump University?
Absolutely. You just have to make a really generous donation to my online Trump University GoFundMe.
All right. Well, today we're going to talk a little bit about campuses. And I'm a professor at the University of Houston. And before the semester started, it's the first time they've been live for over a year because of COVID. And before the semester started, the provost sent out a directive saying that we could not make any rules regarding masks or vaccines, and we were not even allowed to ask students if they or make students wear masks or ask them about vaccines, which I find ironic, right? They've just dumped tens of millions of dollars, many hundreds of millions of dollars into STEM, right? To study science and technology, and yet we're not allowed to talk about pathogens and the natural world and antibiotics and stuff like that. And of course, there's a free speech issue too. But this is pretty consistent, I think, with what's happening on campus. Now, to be clear, before we start this is clearly an issue that is more pertinent to the right. The right goes after professors, goes after teachers. Here in Texas, they're banning books like crazy. There are anti-BDS laws. I think it's been thrown out, but for a while, if you had a speaker come into the University of Houston, that person had to sign a waiver saying that he or she would never support any kind of boycott or sanctions against Israel, right? So it's clearly been a big issue, but it's also an issue
where they're rightfully banning critical race theory.
Critical race theory is, yeah, exactly. And that's the guys that in Texas now, they've just banned 2 books that were written for 7th graders. I don't even know if that's young adult fiction, but based on 7th graders are learning critical race theory according to the crazy batshit Taliban of Texas. But it is an issue on the left, even though I think a lot of people on the left deny it. And it's not nearly as bad as it's on the right, but it's not right. And I think radical leftists and Marxists and anarchists should support free expression. Now, that doesn't mean you can't punch Richard Spencer in the mouth. There's, that's legit. But at the same time, I think we're gonna talk about a few cases here that I think have gotten some people worked up, and probably will get some of our listeners upset. But that's kind of what we're here for. We're trying to jolt you, and it's Halloween, so we're trying to scare you. And I'm getting kind of scared just looking at this orange thing next to me. I'm glad I'm far away. He's in the Bay Area and I'm in Texas, because if he was nearby, it would be really kind of terrifying. I think there's a bad
It was
vibe.
very terrifying for me to fly into the Bay Area with all the all the snowflake liberals and radical socialists that overrun this place.
Texas is trying to get rid of 850 books. Who's the snowflakes, right? That's one of the great irons. But there are leftists and liberal snowflakes, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today, and hopefully jolt people and maybe even get somebody angry or scared on Halloween. But a case that's been talked about a lot lately occurred at the University of Michigan. There is a really pretty well-known composer named Bright Sheng, who is a musician and a professor. And he is a survivor of the Cultural Revolution, which, is kind of a big deal. Now, there's some repression for you, right? The Red Guard running around. According to the Republicans, that's what the Democrats are today, right? They're having a cultural revolution under the Red Guard. But this guy, this reminds me, in the 1970s, the Cincinnati Reds were called the Big Red Machine. And, they won 2 World Series in a row. And that the year after the second one, a pitcher from the Boston Red Sox, Bill Lee, who was flaky, he used to put weed on his pancakes, said he was going to go to China in the offseason because he wanted to see the real Big Red Machine. So I always enjoyed that.
Bob, all this talk about China is just scaring me too much. I think I'm going to just have to drop off. I'll catch up with you later.
Well, we're going to try to see if we can patch Scott back in. Okay. So because, thankfully, you have no idea what I just went through. It was really terrifying, but I guess Trump had a fundraiser. Maybe he and Lauren Boebert are going quail hunting with Dick Cheney and who was the guy he shot in the face? I forget, but
yeah, I think it was
he shot a guy in the face. It was like he shot a guy in the face.
Yeah.
And the Cheneys are now the reasonable face of the Republican Party.
Well, they're the latest part of the resistance, right?
I never thought in my lifetime, I thought, you don't fuck with a Cheney. That's like messing with the mafia, right? And that's how screwed up these people are, that the Cheneys are fair game. At any rate, but Bright Sheng on September 10th, he was teaching a class about how you take and adapt something from the stage and you put it into a movie, right? He showed a scene from Othello, Shakespeare, right? 1965, starring Laurence Olivier, one of the most famous actors ever. Olivier played Othello in blackface. So we already know what's coming, right? Blackface is obviously insensitive. We don't advocate that. But he showed this, and of course, things have happened since then. He invaded the safe space of students. And one freshman said, "I was stunned. In such a school that preaches diversity and making sure they understand the history of POC, I was shocked that Sheng would show something like this, and it's something that's supposed to be a safe space." All right. And I think something that I'm only speaking for myself here, not for Scott, because on topics like this, I don't want to get anybody else in trouble. But we've talked a lot about how dangerous the world is and how dangerous my previous guest was. And, there are people who call him a fascist and talk about Nazis and stormtroopers and coups and all that kind of stuff. If you believe that, or even if you just believe they're kind of crazy and dangerous, you need to take them on. And it's kind of hard to go hard scrabble against people in the streets if you're going to be offended and demand a safe space from a movie that's 55 years old, right? And so Bright Sheng's class was canceled, and I'm not sure if he's teaching or not now, but this is not a good trend. It's if people don't like something, then have a debate on it, have a discussion on it. But the reality is that that's the way movies were done, and in 1965, and that would, to me, be an occasion for like a really good discussion about Hollywood, about race, about tropes, however you want to make it. But to simply ban it and get a professor in trouble for it is kind of frightening, I think. And I know that the world is kind of heading in that direction in a lot of ways. And again, this pales in comparison to what the right wing is doing, on issues like BDS or banning books or critical race theory. But it's a bad look, and it also gives, remember when we had Noam Chomsky and he said this stuff's a gift to the right, and I think it is, because it's preposterous. Yeah. Do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, I think just the important thing is, I think part of this is just the way some of our media and digital media culture has evolved, but it's much easier to spend a lot of time being upset about things like this, while there's still, there's actually, police are gunning down Black people in the streets. And like, to be fair, millions of people hit the streets on that last year.
Yeah.
But like, Twitter, clicking on Twitter is actually not the most effective way to, kind of like push for change. And I think it's honestly, we talk about this a lot. It's part of the reason that the right is so easily just like mowing over the Democrats and the people who support them. It's just, there's too much of it to, it's a distraction. And it's like Noam said, it's like this distraction is actually doesn't do anything but, help the right and help the ruling class.
Yeah, it's a huge distraction. I hate to invoke this concept, but it's also a real good case of privilege. At the University of Michigan, you can claim that your safe space has been invaded by watching a video from an old movie that's insensitive. Whereas like in real world, safe spaces are being invaded, like you said, by armed police and by Proud Boys and by crazy ass supporters of my previous co-hosts who are now issuing death threats to doctors and to school board members. In Ohio, the head of the Board of Education, who was appointed by a Republican, recently resigned because Ohio, after the George Floyd murder, passed a resolution simply saying like, racism is bad. And she got so much flack for that, she's resigned because she supported a resolution saying racism is bad. So there's no doubt this is not an equivalency, but the media, as you point out, loves to turn it into that, right? And it's also a sense of privilege. Like I remember years ago when they kept talking about trigger warnings, right? You have to warn somebody that there may be a scene in this that they won't like or may traumatize them. The real trigger warnings in America should come for guns, right? Because that's real. And that's a problem. I mean, there are, huge numbers. I forget the numbers of gun. I think there's like something like 30-some thousand gun deaths in America every year. Over 20,000 of them are suicides. And yet nobody, every time there's a mass killing, we get, oh, it's about white privilege. It's about toxic masculinity. It's about the lack of religion in schools. No, it's about guns, and so we get a lot of that. And I just think, like you said, it's a distraction. I think another issue, which I'm sure will piss people off, is like we're in the World Series right now and the Atlanta Braves are in it. The Atlanta Braves, the team's name is offensive. Native Americans have said that. During the games, they do this kind of tomahawk chop, this exaggerated, looks like it's from a 1940s Cowboys and Indians movement, this chant. It's offensive. It should definitely be gone. I mean, Major League Baseball and the Braves should discourage, do whatever they can. I would not be in favor of kicking people out of the stadium because I do believe there's a free speech issue, but it's obnoxious and it needs to go. My point here would be, however, that I have seen such an apoplectic response to that. Whereas just 2-3 weeks ago, we were talking to you from Washington, D.C. about huge protests staged by indigenous peoples about pipelines. Indigenous lands right now are just being taken over for these pipelines, which are, environmentally catastrophic as well.
Treaty rights violated.
Treaty rights violated. Now that, and it got some publicity, but it had a short shelf life. The Washington Post, I think, was the only major media to cover it like in some detail because it happened in Washington. But even on the left, I mean, it doesn't compare to what we're seeing about the Atlanta Braves. And again, I mean, we are not apologizing for the Braves or for the tomahawk chant or any of that kind of stuff. But I think it's okay to prioritize things and try to figure out what a strategy and what a tactic would be. And the basic response, not just from the right, but from a lot of people, is like, come on, it's a chant, or the Cleveland Indians, used to be the Indians, have changed their name this year to the Cleveland Guardians. I'm all in favor of it. I'm from that area. Got into a lot of arguments last summer with people, saying, yeah, it's a good idea to get rid of the name. At the same time, I do think it's okay to decide what you want to make your dominant stories and the dominant themes. And, call me crazy or call me a reactionary, and I know, just say, well, you're a white guy, you're talking about this. We don't give a shit what you think. But I do think that pipelines and treaty rights and the impoverishment of indigenous peoples is more important than baseball teams. So, and it's something I think we really should address. And it's not to say that these issues aren't important. But Now, also, and I think you read this because I think you sent it to me or I sent it to you, but the Cornel West recently kind of caught some hell, right? Howard University, the kind of almost, I guess you could almost consider kind of like the Harvard of African-American HBCUs, has decided to disband its Department of Classics, the canon of the great white men, right? And Cornel West, who I would argue is the most esteemed African-American scholar in the country. I mean, kind of in the tradition of, the greats, Du Bois, James Cone, people like that, has spoken out against it. And I don't know.
We want to get him on the show if anyone has the
contact. If any of you know Cornel West out there and have a connection, we will we'll pay or we'll do something.
We'll send you postcards.
We'll send you postcards and we'll have you on as a guest. But anyway, I don't know if you read that, Scott. I know you've been really busy and had a lot going on, but I don't know if you were able to read his op-ed on that.
Yeah, I think that Professor West makes the really important point is to, like, if we're going to function in society as it currently exists, then being educated on the classics, on the canon, is going to be an important component in fighting these, like, institutions that are rooted in racism or colonialism or capitalism or whatever. And he doesn't say don't that non-classics shouldn't be taught or anything along those lines. He just makes a point is like we need to have like a kind of bigger and deeper understanding of this of society as it is today in order to combat these terrible isms. And I think that's an important point. I think it's akin to the sort of like book banning and the banning of critical race theory that the right does. It's like we need to have understanding of what Plato said or what George Eliot said, etc. So
yeah, the op-ed is in the Washington Post, which I assume is probably, I don't know if it's public available or from your subscription, but he opens by talking about Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King, two of the other, there's if you want to make the A list of African-American intellectuals, obviously they'd be on it. And Douglass talked about how important it was for him to read like Socrates and Cicero and Cato, and King reread Socrates before he wrote a letter from a Birmingham jail. And Cornel West isn't saying you should teach this, get rid of it. He said you should add to it. In Virginia, the Republicans may very well win the governor's race there in a couple of days for lots of reasons. For the Democrats, of their infinite wisdom, are running a guy who's already been governor twice, who was a huge fundraiser for the Clintons, right? So that's them. They go, future to the back or whatever you want to call it. They're still in the 90s. But at any rate,
they're also acting like they're running the recall election in California too. Like a month ago.
But one of the issues there has become critical race theory because a white woman has said her son was traumatized because they made him read Toni Morrison's Beloved, right? So one mother in Virginia now gets to decide, I guess, what the curriculum is. And so, Cornel West and these people, obviously, that's insane, right? You can't do that. But the right takes that and says, see, they're going to get rid of all the classics and make you read this stuff, right? And they're insane. That just the stuff they do, it's incomprehensible, right? But West says some stuff which I think is really powerful, and I just want to kind of read a little bit about it. The Western canon is, more than anything, a conversation among great thinkers over generations that goes richer the more we add our own voices and the excellence of voices from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and everywhere else in the world. We should never cancel voices in this conversation, whether that voice is Homer. I'm assuming he means the Greek, not Simpson, but I would put Homer Simpson in that as one of the great white
belongs in the canon for sure.
Belongs in the canon too. Or students at Howard. This is no ordinary discussion, right? And then this is I think kind of the part that I really found very, very powerful and important. Howard University is not removing its classic department in isolation. This is the result of a massive failure across the nation in schooling, which you put some quotation marks, which is now nothing more than the acquisition of skills, the acquisition of labels, and the acquisition of jargon. Schooling is not education. Education draws out the uniqueness of people to be all they can be in the light of their irreducible singularity. It is the maturation and cultivation of spiritually intact and morally equipped human beings. And I hate to compare these two, but Cornel West is almost kind of saying what James Carville said about 6 months ago when he talked about faculty lounge jargon. And I think we are, unfortunately, and this is my world, and it's not an easy place to live. You really, have to, the other day I was ranting and raving in class about Texas, banning books and things like that, and using critical race theory as this BS excuse, and a student said, well, is there anything you wouldn't allow to be taught in class? Like, well, you have to be sensitive to young kids, obviously, but there are classes which teach for a lot of people, reading the Communist Manifesto is triggering, or it's not a safe space, right? So I'm pretty, open. I mean, you shouldn't be teaching having seventh graders read books with graphic examples in them or something like that. But yeah, for the most part, I would err on the side of letting them be exposed to these ideas. I mean, I always tell my students, part of coming to college is to learn different things and occasionally get jolted. And I think that's what I think, would agree with that. Cornel West would agree with that. I mean, when you were in college, were there any, you kind of read pretty much what you wanted, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, they assigned my freshman English, we read like Autobiography of Malcolm X. We read everything from some Greek classics to the Autobiography of Malcolm X and I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. And I mean, it was an important spectrum, but within classics of to have a better understanding of how society works. I mean, I'm a big believer in the reason that we take humanities and social science classes is to have critical thinking and to have an understanding of what's going on around us and why.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I mean, like we said, I think there's another big issue on the left here, which is about tactics and strategy. And people, I think, tend to act very spontaneously on issues like this. And they go to Twitter. I mean, I don't read HuffPost, but my Facebook feed is filled with HuffPost articles, which just thrive on this stuff. They live for it. And so you get the idea that every college student out there, I mean, this is happening for the most part at places like Michigan and Dartmouth and Oberlin. And, it really, at the University of Houston, I'm not terribly concerned that anybody's going to be, this is a kind of a working class school, a lot of first generation students, but the media just jumps all over it. And there is a kind of a strategic and tactical issue here about what you want to go out there and try to rally people with. And if you really want to create a movement, and as we often say, meet people where they're at, I'm not sure that banning a 1965 movie and getting a professor in trouble for it is probably the way to go. I'm not sure if you go to Pittsburgh or Detroit or Youngstown or Mobile, Alabama, or Jackson, Mississippi, or New Orleans, that's going to be a great way to engage people. Or even, as offensive and odious as it is, I don't think most people are going to be like all that motivated to do anything politically because of the Atlanta Braves chance. And that's dangerous. And, obviously, if we continue along these lines that, basically saying it's okay to get rid of certain things, the Autobiography of Malcolm X and I Know Why the Cage Birds Sing are far more likely to go than pretty much anything else.
Well, I mean, and when we talk about and we had an episode on this a couple of months ago with Ben Burgess, but talking about cancel culture is that the real cancel culture is actually what is coming from the right. And I know you have a couple of examples of that.
Yeah.
But,
absolutely.
Also,
I mean,
people who post anti-Zionist, anti-Israel things are targeted a lot, right?
That is
Lynn Cheney is being targeted. Her advisors are being targeted for working with her by Kevin McCarthy, by the right.
Yeah, I would say actually Israel, without a doubt, is the most contentious issue. I felt it personally. You were here, in 2002. I had a radio show on Pacifica, and the people at Pacifica at KPFT here had the Jewish consulate, the Israeli consulate gave them their own show called Jewish Voices, and it was just reprehensible. And I came on after them. These were during the massacres at Jenin during the Second Intifada, and I made a comment about it, and I just got vilified and attacked. No one at Pacifica stood up for me, including St. Amy Goodman. So I kind of, and that's nothing. I mean, I'm a professor. That was just a side gig that I wasn't getting paid for. But I saw it firsthand. That's you don't want to mess with Israel if you want to get like literally canceled. Look at Steven Saleda, a very well-known professor, was hired at the University of Illinois. Some of his old tweets resurfaced, and big money donors made the university get rid of him, right? So that's, without a doubt, if you want to go after cancel culture, that would be where you start. BDS, criticizing Israel, supporting Palestine. That's by far the most dangerous thing you can do in public life. I mean, look at the way they're going after some of the few members of Congress who had the integrity to vote against, AOC, wouldn't even vote. She just said present, right? So, I mean, when we get started on this, it's a right-wing thing. It's CRT, it's Israel. But it has become like the excuse given. And so a couple really disturbing things happened this week. The first, more minor, the second, big. In Florida, there is a court case about DeSantis's handling of the COVID crisis, right? And so professors from the University of Florida who are experts in public health were scheduled to testify. Professors testify in court cases all the time as expert witnesses. I've never done it. I've been approached, and I just didn't have the skills that they needed, right? But it just happens all the time. The University of Florida has explicitly said that its professors are not allowed to testify in court against the state of Florida, right? And essentially, they weren't really hiding it. They said, they're the people who fund us, so we don't want to piss them off, right? And so this is obviously disturbing because there are real questions. I mean, this is a state university. You have free expression, First Amendment issues. This, it's like those women at Collin College who we talked to. Susan Statler Jones has filed a lawsuit. Now Laura Burnett has filed a lawsuit against them. And this is happening now, in a lot of places where simply by, tweeting something or saying something, you're in peril. And what's happening here is a million times worse than what's happening at the University of Michigan. Yet, we have a professor at the University of Michigan who survived the Cultural Revolution, whose job is now in peril for showing a clip. And, they're not equivalent. And yet the outcomes are far too similar, I think, for my taste. But so that's disturbing. And I think you're going to see this more and more. Universities, I know Scott studied SDS, and I think people don't realize that SDS got started actually kind of as a critique of the university as much as anything else, kind of the nuclear society, but also the university. And one of the seminal incidents there was the free speech movement, right, out in your part of the world.
Yep. In the Port Huron statement, I guess the revised version, not the original, non-sellout version.
Right.
For people who get that reference.
Yeah.
Extra points if you get the reference.
Yeah.
They're real critical about how the university was turning students into consumers, how the corporatization of campus, how companies, and this is still a thing today. We're at the point now where people don't even talk about it or notice anymore. But the defense industry and the petrochemical industry, all of these corporate entities put money into research, R&D, all of that into the university, which the Port Huron statement came out in 1962, and and then by the time we get into the Vietnam War, it's like they're running on the high because they're actually doing a lot of research and development, which is leading to bombs and chemicals and things being dropped on the Vietnamese people. And then here in Berkeley, just not far away from where I am right now, we had an uprising around the free speech movement, which was actually pushing back on that corporatization, that consumerization of campus and students. And that kind of ties back into what we're talking about today, is that they want students to be good, what they would say is good citizens, but what they really want them to be is good consumers and good corporate citizens, and go get jobs working for JP Morgan Chase or Exxon or what have you, but not be one who is questioning authority, questioning the status quo, because the status quo has, evolved into where the world is literally on fire here in California, where people are drowning in other parts of the world, where police and military are gunning down people who are, pushing back, or it's just they don't, fit into a certain like mode that society deems as acceptable. So
in the 19 oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
The one last thing I'll say is that any professors, who are teaching anything out of the status quo are being systematically targeted in different ways, sometimes policy wise, like lack of, taking away tenure, sometimes as individuals who are like critical of, these conservative institutions.
Yeah, they're also like these insane right-wing groups like what's the one with Charlie Kirk and Candace Owen, who are, wow, I mean, crazy doesn't begin, but they're like, actually they have like hit lists on the media of professors they don't like. Some of these people
and
are
David Horowitz did that in a previous,
who used to be a Stalinist, right? Yeah. But I'm a history prof, right? In the 50s, the world was kind of captivated by this idea of modernization, to go into the third world and bring it like industrialization and reform and all that kind of stuff. Universities had a major role to play, and like probably the best known, and if you've ever read anything about Vietnam or studied it, you've probably heard of the Michigan State Group. Michigan State was given huge government contracts to send people to southern Vietnam, right, where they train the police and where they help train the government of the, I mean, these guys actually helped set up the apparatus for the repression in the South. We've probably all heard of the Los Chicago, many of us at least have heard of the Los Chicago Boys, right? Went down to Chile. And just a plug here, don't forget to listen, if you haven't yet, to our great show with our comrade from Oz, Clinton Fernandez, about Chile. The other Oz, the good Oz, right? So the universities, I mean, have had a huge role in this. Few people know this because Dwight Eisenhower's farewell address is well known, as it should be, for his warnings about the military industrial complex. But go read it. He also talks about the universities. And he said, government contracts have become a replacement for the pursuit of free expression. Eisenhower would be like part of the squad today, I favored, support of unions, all that kind of stuff, right? But it's kind of crazy. And so in Berkeley, when I was out a couple of years ago for your wedding, with Dirty Pete, or just Pete, I don't know what he is now, but shout out to Pete, who we need to get on, by the way. In the library there, what's that?
He's too scared to go live with his opinions.
But in the library, there was very touching. I got choked up because there's a tribute to Mario Savio in there, who is, really famous. This is, October's Italian American Heritage Month, so I've been on Facebook putting up a different Italian or group of Italians every day, and Mario Savio was obviously one of them. But the president of California, Clark Kerr, talked about what he called the multiversity, not the university, but the multiversity, right? And part of the multiversity was an explicit approach toward going out and working with the state, the Department of Defense, the CIA, USAID, whoever, to create expertise, right? And as part of that, when universities and public education in general went for funding in the 50s and 60s, there was an explicit military connection to it. So, like in order to get more money for education in the 50s, it became like the Army Mathematics Act, right? And the idea there was, after Sputnik, especially, we need to train people, and so that's why, the humanities has never been anywhere near as important or funded. And people in the humanities are targeted, obviously, far more than people who can end up working for the Pentagon or the military industrial complex. And during that free speech protest, Mario Savio just gave one of the most poignant and powerful speeches ever. I play it in class, in 2021, it doesn't hit the same way, but he says, there comes a time when the operations of the machine become so odious, make you so sick at heart, you have to throw your body on the gears and make it stop. And that's the moment where we are now. But instead of doing that, you have students kind of snitching or complaining about safe spaces, which I don't know if you have anything else to say about that, leads to, I think, the most frightening. This is really a scary Halloween thing. But Georgia, which is an odd place, right? It has two, relatively moderate liberal, whatever you want to call them, senators, but it's also run by Republicans who Trump hates and who actually have stood up to him. It's a weird place, right? It's but Georgia now is moving to remove tenure. They want to be able to get rid of professors without faculty input based on really nebulous standards. If you're in academia, you'll often hear the phrase, not a good fit. And not a good fit or collegiality tend to be ways to get rid of people you don't like. It's hard to get rid of people with tenure, as it should be. I mean, tenure, the idea of tenure is to protect you from people like that, right? And as somebody who's been on the receiving end, I've tried to organize unions on campus. I've written a lot of stuff in the school papers about the university administrators and the presidents. And, I'm Italian, so I tend to say things kind of like Homer. I don't really think about them. I just say them, right? So Homer Simpson.
Organizing anti-war rallies and anti-corporate globalization,
Well, you were there. Remember
like that,
the day the war in 2003, the day the war against Iraq began, like universities now have free speech zones. So if you want to have a rally, you have to get a permit ahead of time, and there are only certain areas. So the war began. So I remember that day we got a hold of a microphone and we just went in front of the library, and we probably had 600-700 people there. And I don't know if I still have it, but I remember getting my reprimand from the university because I had violated various things, including I didn't get a permit for it and I was not in a free speech zone. So I was actually kind of proud of that. But yeah, this is the way it's done now. And the thing is, they've kind of convinced people this is the way it should be. And so Georgia, which is really the only, no one else, no other state, and Texas is right behind. Texas is probably going to do this next week, because anytime Texas isn't the first state to do something like incredibly, insanely reactionary, batshit crazy, they're going to double down, right? So I'm sure they're going to do this like really quickly, and it's going to be way worse. But in Georgia, you can just basically dismiss people now without really any kind of cause. It's an outlier. Professors associations, the AUP is upset about it. The Board of Regents, unanimously voted for it. But you want to talk about a kind of a bizarre, nonsensical, Orwellian explanation. This is from a spokesperson for the state of Georgia system, Lance Wallace. The goals of the changes are to support career development for all faculty, as well as ensure continued accountability and continued strong performance from faculty members after they've achieved tenure, right? Ultimately, we all have the same goal. So it's pretty crazy stuff. There won't be any peer review in this. Generally getting rid of a professor according to AUP regulations is not easy. It's a long process. It takes a while. Georgia has just streamlined it to if the dean doesn't want you, you're gone. We're not talking about people who aren't tenured. It's actually pretty easy to get rid of somebody who doesn't have tenure. You just deny him tenure. That happens with more regularity than I think people know. But now we're talking about people who are tenured, right?
I have a kind of bigger picture thing to say about this.
Sure.
Yeah, we actually were talking.
We don't censor here at Green and Red Podcast. You can say anything.
We were talking a little bit ago about the left not having a strategy. I think the right does, and the right actually, particularly in these Sunbelt states, Florida, Georgia, Texas, Arizona, they're actually really seeing the writing on the wall about how demographics are shifting. Younger people are way more to the left than they used to be. It's a lot of immigration. And then, in these urban areas, whether it's Miami or Atlanta or Houston or Phoenix, the trend is shifting way more to liberal perspectives. We could say the Democrats, but, it's also what's given us Kristen Sinema. But, their strategy is to try and contain that. And so, we see voting rights restrictions being passed. We see prisons being built out in these states. We're seeing things like this where they're working to deny, to do away with tenure on campus. I'm sure this tenure thing is going to happen in Texas and Florida and states like that next, right? And so they realize that it's increasingly becoming, and I'm not being cute with this expression, an apartheid state, and they're trying to hold on to power as much as they can. And so it's just like a kind of important thing to kind of like realize is that this is a plan. It's a strategy that they've probably had since the 70s or something, probably longer. But I just want to point out that there's they have a strategy, and that we on the left, and this is like one thing we like to promote on Green and Red, is like, we don't just like to complain about the left. We also like to point out, like, it would be great if there was a strategy on the left to be able to counter some of this, because we actually do have the numbers and we do actually have the power.
Yeah.
We just don't have enough of a plan, it seems like. So
No, I think talking about Scaaarry, the 1960s scared the hell out of the university administrators, politicians, and others, because you had students, like the free speech movement, like Mario Savio, like SDS, like anti-war movements, like Kent State, which we did a great show on the 50th anniversary in May of 2020. That terrified professors, because students were actually going out there and using, like their imaginations and creativity, and learning things, not just being taught. I mean, I'm a professor of history, and I've always wanted history to become like really important in American life, and now it is. But unfortunately, it's because of Trump and these crazy, what was it, the 1776 Commission, all that kind of shit. And so they're using history as this counter, liberatory force, which is unfortunate.
they're weaponizing it, right?
They're wet, absolutely. And then, you're right, the left has no strategy. I mean, the Italian right in the 70s had a strategy which it called like constant friction or constant tension, I can't remember what, which is to constantly keep pressure on the state. Well, that's what the right wing in America does. Nothing is too small to go after. So one student in Virginia is traumatized by a Toni Morrison novel, and that actually becomes like maybe one of the more important issues in the entire governor's race, right? And you have, a professor fired at more than one professor fired at Collin College. And part of the reason they gave for firing Susan Staylor Jones was she had signed an article saying you should take down Confederate statues. She signed it and she said Collin College, right? Now, we've said this before on the show. When you do that, I've signed a million things. It says for identification purposes only, right? But she was against Confederate statues, just like NASCAR, just like, would ban the flag, just like the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which got rid of Confederate base names, right? And so they're firing her. She's going to court right now. And so the left has to understand that, if you have an issue with what, a professor showing a film clip, that's fine. Talk about it. Like, that's no longer part of the, like, I remember as a kid, like when I was in college, like if you had a problem, you talk to the professor. I tell my students all the time, you got a problem, talk to me, and that's no longer, it's a consumption society. The university is a poorly run corporation. It's a consumer corporation. And now if you don't get the satisfaction you want, you you ask for the manager, right? I want to see the manager. And you don't talk to the professor or anything like that, it's really scary. And, I'm not gonna, universities are flawed. If you're on the inside, you probably see it more than anybody. And I'm certainly not going to say that everybody should go to college, and I'm not going to look down on people who don't or anything like that. But, universities are important for inculcating people with different kinds of ideas and different kinds of ways to look at things critically and different points of view. And, and especially now, when a world where people Google stuff and you have algorithms determining what you get to see, and people are making decisions and learning history based on memes, these attacks on the universities are really frightening. And I think that, attacking people for showing a film clip from 1965 that's insensitive, or getting rid of an entire department of classics, is really feeding into that, and it's playing into the hands of people who don't have your interests. And it's not a slippery slope argument per se, but it's a way for them to change the narrative and go after you. And they're just much better at it. The right wing is much better. Somebody the other day said something like, why are you always attacking Sinema and Manchin? Why don't you go after the Republicans? It's like, because if I went down to hell, I wouldn't tell everybody Satan was evil. Like, everybody knows it, that says he wants to be, right? The GOP knows what they are. They're obstructed. They don't hide it. So you have to kind of clean up your own house, because that's the barrier to it. And, having these things with where Cornel West, even says this is jargon, and we really need to get away from this. We need to be educated and not just go there to acquire skills you think are going to help you, which anymore, I think half college graduates are in jobs that really don't require, college degrees. We have a systemic crisis now with capitalism and employment, and universities are really feeding into that. Students are, $1.6 trillion in student debt now. So we have an indebted group of young people. who are getting degrees and which are no longer really guaranteeing them, any kind of really decent future. Higher ed is like that. I think something like 3/4 of classes now are taught by contingent professors, which means professors who aren't tenured, who are maybe visiting profs or adjuncts or grad students or whatever. And there are strike. We had a what was that? One of our first shows ever was on the strike in the UC system, grad students. So it's a scary. I mean, this is what scares me on
UC Santa
Halloween.
Cruz.
UC Santa Cruz, yeah. So I mean, this scares me on Halloween more than vampires and ghosts. It's the way the right is determining and dominating intellectual discourse, and just absolutely dominating it, right?
Yeah. It's all as scary as your the guest host earlier.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about anything scarier than that, but
so the other thing, as we're kind of moving towards the end of this part of the segment, is that we still have a love them, they're liberals segment, and if we're ready to shift over to that.
Sure.
Yep. So for the week in review, just some updates. We'll still be doing these from time to time. We're also going to be putting them on the audio platform, and then we get a lot of kicks out of doing the love them, you're a liberal, love them, they're liberals sort of segment, because it's an opportunity for us to vent and gripe and rant, etc. And so I'm going to do the one today, which is sorry, I kept hitting mute there. Many people probably enjoyed that. The person we're going to talk about today is not necessarily a liberal. He was often classified as a liberal Republican, but it's General Colin Powell, former chair of the Joint Chiefs. He was Secretary of State, and he passed away. We didn't get to talk about it because we didn't do a week in review last week, but we didn't. So we didn't talk about it, but I kind of wanted to just kind of bring it up because I think it was an important thing. Colin Powell, there's a couple of different pieces I'm going to talk about when we talk about Colin Powell. One is his military career, and then I'm going to talk about his career within, some of the institutions of power, like namely the White House. One, he was actually a major during the Vietnam War and actually did a whole lot to cover up the My Lai massacre. When you actually look back and look at the story of what happened with the My Lai massacre, where a company of was it Marines or Army? An Army company actually massacred something like 200 civilians.
Charlie Company. Yeah.
Charlie Company in Vietnam. And we've talked about this on the show a little bit because we've talked actually about some of the heroes of the day of My Lai. Colin Powell was not one of those people. He actually did everything he could to cover that up and kind of prevent it from getting out. And so that was, I believe he was an Army major at the time when he did that. And then just to fast forward a little bit to the 80s, Colin Powell was actually the Director of National Security Advisor in the Reagan White House. And this was actually kind of like mid to late 80s. He had this position. He was a general by this point, but he was actually the Deputy National Security Advisor. And this is a period when Reagan was very much deeply entrenched in the Central America wars and the Contra wars. And so there was a lot of policy that led to the massacre of tens of thousands of Nicaraguans, Salvadorans, Hondurans, Guatemalans. And so, Powell's fingerprints were all over that. Powell also then went on to become the chair of the Joint Chiefs. He was the chair of the Joint Chiefs during Desert Storm in '91, which was also a pretty brutal massacre in many ways of Iraqis. And then the sort of big thing that I think he'll be which I actually think he'll be most remembered for, hopefully he'll be most remembered for, was he became George W. Bush's Secretary of State. And he famously went up in front of the United Nations and made a pitch for the invasion of Iraq in 2003. I'm going to actually show a video from this. And
Share with you, when combined with what all of us have learned over the years, is deeply troubling. What you will see is an accumulation of facts and disturbing patterns of behavior. The facts in Iraq's behavior demonstrate that Saddam Hussein and his regime have made no effort to disarm as required by the international community. Indeed, the facts and Iraq's behavior show that Saddam Hussein and his regime are concealing their efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction. None of this should come as a surprise to any of us. Terrorism has been a tool used by Saddam for decades. Saddam was a supporter of terrorism long before these terrorist networks had a name. And this support continues. The nexus of poisons and terror is new. The nexus of Iraq and terror is old. The combination.
So this, this goes on and on, this speech, but this is the argument that Powell made for the Bush administration to invade Iraq. This is what, basically cleared the air with the international community, even though a lot of members of the international community still opposed it and kind of fought back against it. But like the Bush administrators put up the most known prestigious member of its administration to kind of make this argument. You can actually see the CIA director, George Tenet, for those of you who saw the video, who are watching this on video, behind him as like a sort of like in a support role to like, this is true. And so Powell basically just went up and told a whole bunch of lies. It's kind of been reflected back on that Powell actually knew that he was lying. And that has led to, these devastating wars in the Middle East. It's led to the rise of ISIS. It's led to the, it led to the meltdown in not just Iraq, but also Syria. And it's also just kind of turned the Middle East into like a much more dangerous place. And then here we are like almost 20 years later, and it's still, it's just a disaster. And a lot of it is because of Powell. The next phase I'm actually going to talk about with Powell, which is people, don't talk about as much, is that Powell then had a little bit of, he left the administration. And then when Obama ran in 2008, he came out and endorsed Obama in 2008, which was like a big moment. He endorsed, as someone who announced that he was a Republican, a Black Republican. Then he came out and endorsed Obama over McCain. He also endorsed Obama in 2012. But also what he did during that period is he was a bit of a defender and apologist for Obama's drone assassination program. He was a defender of a lot of Obama's defense and national security policies, foreign policy interventions, et cetera. And so partially because he was a liberal Black Republican who came up in the Republican Party, partially because of his support of the Obama administration's policies, he's very much a darling of the liberal establishment. We actually jokingly often talk about the liberal resistance to Trump, which has expanded to include Mitt Romney and Dick Cheney and lots of these other like horrible Republicans. But like Colin Powell in the early was the early member of that sort of liberal resistance. Yeah. And so I just want to kind of like point that out. And so that's why we're tagging him in our Love 'Em Their Liberals segment this week.
Well, and looping back to the stuff we talked about earlier, which I think is, kind of the real issue here. I mean, Colin Powell is who he is, and he did actually show some consternation later. But the real issue is the way the liberals dealt with him when he died. It reminded me of John McCain's, when John McCain died, how everybody was talking about what a great guy he was and all that kind of stuff. But Cornel West, who we mentioned earlier, and a scholar named Walter Ben Michaels have written a lot of stuff about diversity. And this is a good example of that because Powell represents that at its zenith, right? This is diversity. But what we have is a diversity.
It's woke empire, right?
It's woke empire, right? You don't have a diversity of ideas and ideologies. So, as Michaels and Cornel West always point out, a lot of liberals would be happy if the 1% reflected a demographic breakdown of the way the world was structured. So you would have X number of white Europeans and X number of Asians and X number of Africans and so forth, right? And so, I mean, no one's against diversity, obviously, but into itself, it can become just kind of an exercise in mathematics. And Colin Powell clearly fit into that. He was put forth, you know, I mean, smart guy, knew what he was talking about, but he became kind of the epitome of diversity. And as I often point out, maybe it's changed since then, but the most diverse cabinet ever at that point in time was George Bush's. He had Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell. His attorney general was Hispanic. You know, so
Alberto Gonzalez from
Alberto
Humble, Texas.
oh, he's from Humble. That's right. Well, Ted Cruz is from Houston, so boy, I'm in a great area. But Rafael Cruz, right? But I think we need to kind of be more cognizant that there's more to it than that, and so there are these elements of power which I think the left doesn't understand the way it should, or at least liberals don't understand the way they should. And the issue of diversity, you know, should be more nuanced than simply, you know, Colin Powell is an example of how great America is, you know, which is really kind of really, I mean, that was like that big point of his obituaries was, you know, the first, and that's important. You know, I'm not going to downplay that, but at the same time, you know, and like Obama was the first, I think, Black editor of the Harvard Law Review, wasn't he? So, you know, I'd rather point out like the first chair of the Black Panther Party, or, you know, something like that. So at any rate, yeah, Powell and the liberals had a love affair with Colin Powell, and just like they did with John McCain, just like they now do with George Bush, right? Bush is a painter, right? And so, or Meghan McCain or whatever, you know. So it's pretty easy. Liberal, I mean, the GOP is on a scorched earth policy unless you're like totally in line with the most insane elements of that. Whereas the Democrats just throw people over, you know, throw people overboard, like, you know, Katie Hill or, you know, whomever. So it's a scary time. You know, we were the voices of reason in the Trump last year of the Trump regime, right? It's going to be okay. But I think a lot of people, you know, once Trump lost, took that to mean, oh, we're good now. Whereas no, I think actually now the scary part begins, and it's Halloween. So, you know, I'm not a big advocate of panic and fear as strategies, but I think it wouldn't be a bad idea if people went out there and organized and created autonomous or you know, groups and shut down traffic and did something. Because if not, you're going to have President Tom Cotton, who I would find actually way more scary than
Or Ron DeSantis.
on DeSantis, or yeah, whoever else, just way more scary than Trump. So I hope we've scared people enough today. It's Halloween. I'm not a big Halloween guy. I don't dress up or anything like that. Today I'm going as a you know, kind of a professor who, you know, just like likes to rant and rave about things. A loudmouth professor, as someone once called me. So that's my Halloween shtick. And instead of giving out candy, I'm going to give out advice. So yeah.
I'm going as this guy right here. For those of you who are listening, it's the face of Donald Trump floating next to my head.
Again, Berkeley, that might get you canceled in Berkeley.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Unless we have to turn it into like a piñata or something. Folks, you've been listening to the Green and Red podcast, talking about the issues of the day. Check out Bob, for those of you who are just listening, we have a whole lot of postcards that we've been putting out. I actually just did a world tour of New York and Washington, D.C. and other parts of the world, handing them out. If you want some, you can email us at greenredpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like what you're hearing and you want to share it, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, definitely hit that subscribe button. The subscriptions have been going up a little bit lately. And then if you like what we're saying and you want to contribute more than just liking and sharing, and we appreciate that from everyone who does that. But if you want to become a patron, check us out at patreon.com/greenredpodcast, or go to our website and make a one-time donation and by hitting that support button. And all the ways to do that will be there. And we've gotten some donations there lately too, and want to really shout out all the appreciation. We're small and we're scrappy. We're going up against, you know, the worldwide media empires, and we're saying shit that they don't want to hear. So become a patron or make a donation. Also, thanks to all the patrons. We've had a bunch of big push on patrons lately. So
Yeah, and fight back. It's okay to be tough. I mean, we've got some pretty scary enemies out there. So fight back, be tough.
Yep.
And,
question authority.
Question authority, and think globally and guillotine locally.
Yep. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Yeah. You know what it is? There's something in his bloodstream activated by the sunbeams. He's ready to eat cause he's hungry. People respect him, it's humbling. He's focused on one thing. All he wants is to come clean. He's thinking about freedom and how for so many it's unseen. Alienate my mind state, exclude what I exude, erase my alignment and remove what we include. Replace my environment with assignments and rules. Deny your collusions as if I'm some kind of fool. Molotov monologue, false facade falling off. Interrupting the seduction of our destruction, the Holocaust. Intellect infested with sickness and death, affliction and addiction that infected the flesh. Incessant obsession with repression and oppression, deception and oppression, naked aggression and loaded weapons. I'm checking and assessing all assets in my possession. What direction is the exit? That's the essence of the question. Rhyming exotic like an ancient narcotic. Reminding my mind and my body that God is my audience. Keep my cognitive positive. Thought is provocative. I want my prerogative and it's more than just talkative. Situations obvious, observing it, watching it. I'm preserving the documents, though it's burnt in my consciousness. Call it dichotomy. It's perfectly opposite. I'm searching for profits with the heart of a communist.